Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Lev A.C. Rosen to discuss his new novel, Lavender House, published by our friends at Forge Books. Lev A.C. Rosen writes books for people of all ages, most recently Camp, which was a Best Book of the Year from Forbes, Elle, and The Today Show, among others, and is a Lambda finalist and ALA Rainbow List Top 10. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Dan Chaon, the author of 6 previous books, including Ill Will, a national bestseller, named one of the 10 best books of 2017 by Publishers Weekly. Other works include the short story collection Stay Awake, a finalist for the Story Prize, the national bestseller Await Your Reply, and Among the Missing, a finalist for the National Book Award. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post your questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And thank you for ordering your copy of Lavender House from Books and Books and supporting indie bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello and welcome.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
We're both not in Florida.
No, neither of us are in Florida. My in-laws moved to Florida, though. So
nice.
we do visit now and then again.
Yeah, my mother-in-law used to live in Florida. So I have fond memories, but here in snowy Cleveland. You're in New York?
Yeah, I'm in the city, and it got real cold today all of a sudden. First day I had to turn the heat on.
I know. So I was just thinking, have we known each other for 20 years or more?
That can't be possible because I met you in college, and I've only been out of college a decade, Dan.
Well, in any case, we did meet when you were in college. I was a professor and you were a student.
Yes.
And
you were my advisor.
I was your advisor, and you went through the creative writing program at Oberlin College, and that was where you wrote your first novel that I still remember.
Yeah, it's still unpublished first novel.
That I love so much. I still have faith that someday that novel is going to appear. It's called Chain Link Fence, and
I mean, I hope so. It got me an agent, so
right.
and it got me a lot of. I remember when she first sent it around, it got a lot of positive but weird feedback from editors. Like the late great Sonny Mehta read it, and he was like, "This is a very good book, but a terrible first book." He was like, "You need to gather an audience first, and then people will come with you to this very weird book."
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you have not really followed that advice at all. Like every book that you've written has been completely different. It's like different genre, different age group. Was that intentional, or you've written 7 books and none of them could be said to be alike in many ways, except that they're all written by you?
Yeah, I do jump around a lot. I think of myself as like a butterfly going from flower to flower, but I read everything, so I write everything. That's usually my go-to line explaining that. And it's really just, I've never felt a need to stick to a genre, even though I know that's often a good idea for developing an audience and getting people to stick with you. And part of it is, after Almond of Genius, my first one, it did okay, but not great. And so the idea of selling another steampunk novel was kind of off the table for me. So I went somewhere else. And
was the next book the one you wrote with your brother?
It came out. It's interesting. I don't remember which sold first, but Depth and Woundabout, which was the one with my brother, came out around the same time. So it was one of them.
So Roundabout was a grade school novel, or sort of geared towards,
it was heavily illustrated.
Yeah, like geared towards like 3rd to 6th graders. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of 7 to 10. I think it was officially 8 till 12 because the parents die early on, and you got that for some reason that makes it an 8 to 12 as opposed to a 7 to 10. But I think of it as 7 to 10, and yeah, it was sort of about these, you know, kids going to a weird town where nothing ever changes, and they find, you know, mysterious skiers and stuff like that. It was a fable. That's how I think of it, as sort of a contemporary fable.
Right. And then the adult novel was Depth, which was a kind of environmental catastrophe, apocalyptic mystery. I mean, there's mystery and noir kind of run through your work in various ways. I guess Camp doesn't have much noir, but all the other ones.
No, Camp is where I was like, Camp and All Men of Genius are both rom-coms though, so we could go there.
Right.
Yeah.
And then The Memory Wall is YA fantasy. That's probably your saddest book.
Oh my God, it's definitely my saddest book. It is middle grade. It's not YA, it's middle grade. And it's contemporary, but it's story within a story.
Right.
But yeah, it is definitely my saddest book.
Well, it's sort of like a kid who's very involved in this high fantasy video game, and he's dealing with loss and grief and dealing with it through the processing it through this sort of, I guess, kind of magical video game.
Yeah. And like it sort of is playing with the idea of like rescuing the maiden in the tower, because his mother has early onset Alzheimer's, and he thinks she's playing this game online and that she's trying to tell him how to like rescue her and fix her, that she's been misdiagnosed. And so you get to sort of watch him pursue an actual fantasy adventure in the sort of novel within the novel that is the game. And then there's the actual real life stuff. And like, yeah, I think it's my most like literary of novels, interestingly enough. But it is definitely a very depressing read.
I loved it though. I mean, it's really touching. And then after that came your two, the two novels that got you kind of into trouble a little bit, but also brought you more fame. Jack of Hearts and Camp. And both of those books have been banned, right?
I think Camp only like 1 or 2 places, but Jack of Hearts all over. Yeah, all over. I just got another, you know, every time I get my Google alerts, it's a good day if it's not a notification of some challenge or ban. But it's been challenged in, I think, at least a dozen states at this point. And
right. Because it's about a high school guy who is sexually active and gay.
And he's not interested in romance. It's not a romance. And there's all the sex ed stuff in it. And I think the way they talk very frankly about sex and like, you know, desire and the idea of teenagers sort of taking control of their own sexual desire, I think that's very threatening to a lot of people.
Right. And then Camp is just a really glorious high school romantic comedy.
It's my theater kid book. There's no getting around it. It's like, you remember, because you were my advisor, I also directed many musicals.
When you started, you thought you were a playwright.
Yeah, that's right. I was a playwright originally. I worked with David, and then I started writing a novel in my fiction class, and it just kept going. And so we were like, all right, I guess I'm writing a novel now, so I'll switch from playwriting.
I felt good about that.
I felt good about it too. I felt like I was accomplishing more writing the novel than I like with the plays. I felt like I was constantly banging my head against a wall for some reason. And I mean, you know, this is a decade ago, so who remembers exactly? But I remember feeling like I wasn't getting something, like David was trying to teach me something and I just couldn't see it. And sometimes it came down to the fact that I was too stage direction-y, and I was like, this is what they're doing, and obviously that's the sure sign of going over the
I
road.
also think that your imagination is very visual in a lot of ways. I mean, if you had like a movie budget instead of like a stage budget, you might have been able to pull off.
True. If the screenwriting major had been an option, then maybe that's where I would have gone. But we didn't have it at Oberlin then, right? I think they had it by the time you left. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a long story, but there was a person that you didn't like who got into the screenwriting class that we used to talk about all the time, and
okay, yeah, I vaguely remember that now.
And you were really bitter. You were really bitter that person got into the class and you didn't, as I remember.
I was. Well, now I don't remember that much, but
anyway, yeah. But it was too late because you were already a senior.
Oh, that's what it was. Yes, I was a senior. It was too late for me.
Right.
But I was a film minor, so there was that at least.
Yes. So anyway, this brings us to Lavender House, which is kind of a return after 3 books to adult novel. And it is sort of a noir mystery, a little bit like a locked room mystery, right? The kind of
I think someone called it a country estate mystery.
House who done it. That was Publishers Weekly. I didn't know what that meant, but I took it to be sort of like
it's supposed to be like, Poirot, that genre of sort of
right. So what was the inspiration for the book?
Well, I mean, I think that it actually does sort of go back to some of the other and like sort of it combines well with the story of all these books, in that when I wrote Depth originally, I love noir. I love noir.
Right.
I taught at Oberlin. I was a student teacher on noir classes, and I grew up on it. I love all those old mysteries. And with Depth, I wanted to do that, but I felt like I couldn't really write a queer protagonist. I really felt like writing a queer protagonist at that particular time was something that was not going to go over well, was not going to be commercial enough, was not going to be viewed as a novel that would be for a larger audience. And at the time, I still think I was correct. I think that, when it came out, there were no real queer adult commercial novels. And so I wrote a female protagonist, which isn't quite the same. And I brought it to the future to try to embrace the past. But, it was a lot of compromises in some ways. And I'm still really proud of that book. And I really love that book. But it did feel in many ways like the book, like a substitute for something else I wanted to write.
Right.
And then I go into YA where queer protagonists are being embraced, and suddenly I can write them and sort of put myself in the story. And after 2 of those and Camp doing pretty well, I was suddenly like, you know what? I feel like I have enough going for me now. I can try to bring this to adult. I can try to write my historical queer mystery. And that was always in the back of my head. And it wasn't until I was watching some Amazon adaptation of a Christie book. I think it was Ordeal by Innocence, which is like a really fun adaptation. Very campy. The house is 90% staircases, and a chancellor is in it. So it's camp. And I was like, you know what? I can do this. Because this is fun. It would be more fun if everyone were gay. I'm doing it. And that's when I was like, all right, we're making this happen.
Were you a big mystery reader as a young person?
Oh yeah, like the first novel that really that I remember being obsessed with, and it would have been like 7th or 8th grade, was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which is in many ways the first mystery.
Right.
Well, Moonstone maybe, but it was I read that the covers literally came off. That's how many, and I have many copies of it now. And that was sort of the introduction for me. But before that, I'd been into the movies. Like, my parents are big TCM people. I grew up on Bogart and Bacall. Like, I can talk to you about the differences between the two versions of The Big Sleep and why it was changed. So I've always loved those, and I cannot say why. I just really love the old movies. I love Noir and I love Screwball. Those are the two sort of 30s, 40s, 50s genres that I fell in love with.
And they're sort of like the reverse of each other. They're like,
yeah. It's weird. It's like, going from Lavender House to camp.
Right. Did you do a lot of research for the historical stuff?
Oh yeah.
Did you? Oh my God. I'm like in the middle of this right now, and it's like scaring me because I'm doing 1915, and I'm like,
oh boy, that one's harder because there's like less information.
Right, and no movies.
Yeah, no movies. You can't get a sense of the place. Maybe not even, well, some photos certainly, but they were the photos that people had to pose for.
Right.
But yeah, with Lavender House, I owe a lot to the book Wide Open Town by Nan Alamilla Boyd, which is a history of queer San Francisco up to 1965. And that was like kind of my Bible as I was writing this. And I have many other research books. And there's so many good books coming out these days about queer history. Like, we're almost seeing sort of a renaissance from Deviance War to When Brooklyn Was Queer. All of a sudden, we're seeing these books. And in fact, former classmate at Oberlin, Channing Joseph, has a queer history book coming out at some point in the near future that I'm very excited for. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
So, it's suddenly like a lot more of this stuff is accessible, which I'm really grateful for. But Wide Open Town, which has been out almost 20 years, that was really the one I was going to get a sense of this time and place specifically.
Yeah. I think you have never really left New York, right? I mean, except for 4 years in Ohio.
Yeah, no,
why San Francisco?
I did a lot of research on the various queer towns in the 50s. I knew I wanted the 40s or 50s. I knew I wanted pre-Stonewall. And I really wanted to get into sort of the Mattachine Society years, which was like this early gay rights organization. Because I feel like that early historical period for queer people, that moment where, we're sort of starting to find our communities, but also, people are, the Lavender Scare, people are very aware of us and hunting for us. That's a very noir thing. So that blended very naturally to me. So I did research on various cities. And what I found was that New York City, the queer communities in the 50s were much more stratified. It was very like, here's where the wealthy white gays are, here where the poor Italian gays are, here where the Black gays are, and they all had their like places, and they didn't mingle much. San Francisco, there was much more mingling. And that, because I knew it was going to be a series, that felt like it opened up a lot more opportunities. Plus, it's also a classic noir location, so it felt very
right.
Yeah, it felt right to set it there, even if I do wonder if I'm getting like everything wrong all the time in a way that I don't think I would if it were set in New York.
Out there for research trips?
What was that?
Did you head out there for research trips?
No, because I wrote it and then COVID hit. So I've been there once, and it was before I was writing this, but I still did a lot of noir research while I was there. So I walked down the aisle, I walked down the alley where Archer was killed in the Maltese Falcon, which has a little plaque. I did all the sort of noir sort of moments I could find in the city, to sort of get a feel for it. And conveniently, there is so much online, and there are these groups for your research. This will be harder for 1915, if not impossible. But one of the things I really loved was there are groups of people on Facebook essentially being like, remember when? And they like show all their old photos and they talk about things that have changed. And that was extremely useful. So I hope none of them will listen with me.
That's great. Lavender House itself is kind of almost a character in this, and it kind of is a nod in some ways to the fantasy elements that you loved in other. I mean, it's just this kind of magical, somewhat haunted place. Were you basing it on something in particular, or is it just wholly out of your imagination?
It's pretty much just out of my imagination. I mean, once I figured out the soap thing, which was very early, which is that, you know, it's the family seat of a empire, a soap empire, essentially. I knew there had to be like a room for that.
Right.
A room filled with oils and bottles and stuff. And that's, to me, is like the room that feels the most sort of weird and specific. And I just was like, what if it was a wine cellar? That's all I did. I was like, we're going to convert the wine cellar, guys. Otherwise, it all sort of just emerged as I was writing it. And it was sort of like, all right, here are the elements I want to play with. Here are physical details that speak to those elements. So like the dining room has these, you know, it all speaks to the floral nature of things. The greenhouse, which is sort of this important area that mirrors the house, that didn't get added on until like the last edit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was like originally all the conversations he has with the gardener are just outside. And then I was like, all right, I think I should put in a greenhouse. And once I did, it all felt very mirrored and special and it to be there. But it was definitely a last minute change.
Wow, I imagined that you had you had it sort of mapped out like a Clue board game, like there was, you know, the ballroom and.
No, I never did. I can see the dining room and the lounge and the like foyer, the entryway between them with her portrait, which I loved. But other than that, like, and I could not direct you from one of those rooms to their bedrooms. It's just like, this is a room, and between it, lots of stairways and hallways.
There are a lot of stairways and hallways. But I felt very enveloped. I mean, a good portion of the novel takes place in Lavender House. I mean, almost the whole thing, right?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, he goes into town a few times, but
right. But it's very much a character in its own right, and I felt very enveloped by it. Can we talk a little bit about? I mean, you've got Andy, who is a detective who has been outed and is tossed off of the police force and is in a bad state in the beginning of the book. And in classic noir fashion, he's approached by a mysterious woman who has a job for him. She smokes, by the way.
Yes, she did. It was the 50s. They didn't know better, Dan.
So this woman is Pearl, whose wife has died in a mysterious accident that she believes is a murder. She brings Andy back to investigate, and you've got, you know, a kind of a rogues gallery of various suspects who are all living in Lavender House. Did they all come together at once? Did you have like, okay, I know there's going to be Pearl, Henry, Cliff, Margot, and Elsie, and did you have that all mapped out?
Yeah. So early on, I was like, all right, if this is, you know, the original concept was it had to be a house united by a lavender marriage. And that meant a gay man and a lesbian married, and then they would each have a partner. But
Right.
then the question, that didn't feel like enough people. So I was like, who dies? You know, if one of them dies, there's only 3 suspects. So I brought in parents. And, you know, that means Irene and Pearl, Irene being the victim, and Alice, who is Margot's mother, who's come to stay with them, and then the staff.
There's a butler, a
Gardner and
gardener,
yeah.
and a cook, right? Who are all also potential suspects.
Yeah, you know, Pat
Also,
especially. I mean, I feel like they have their moments certainly of suspicion, but they're not as interrogated as much.
right.
Andy doesn't focus on them as much. But yeah, so that I came up with the structure first, and then I did a few things. Like I looked to sort of Noir and Christie archetypes. So like I knew I wanted to do kind of an homme fatale, like a male femme fatale, and I was like, all right, well, that should probably be the boyfriend. Like, let's have him in his robe trying to seduce the detective. Let's have fun with that.
Right.
But then the question sort of became, all right, well, then who is he married to and why is he doing this? And that from the archetype and sort of figuring out why this character would exist in this way, that's where he emerges from. And the others emerged, you know, in similar way. Margot is one of my favorites because, you know, she models this perfect catalog wife as is required for her as the wife of a man leading a soap company. And she talks to the papers and she's in these perfect floral dresses. And she was also, you know, a lesbian who went to the queer bars in a motorcycle jacket. So how did she get from A to B, and what did she give up to get there is sort of the question. And it gets to, you know, it gets to sort of the idea of like, you know, what we give up by performing sort of heteronormativity. But also it gets to the idea of the noir sort of what do we do for what we have? What are we willing to give up about ourselves to get what we want? And that's really a very noir question, I think. But they all pretty much came out of that. The ones I had the most trouble with was Henry, the son, partially because he's on screen the least. He's always working. But once he did his line from All About Eve, he did that moment, I was like, oh, I get this guy, and I could go back and like put him in, and like he made sense. Here's this one line at one point about his Margot Channing impersonation where he's like, I'm not even allowed to do it at parties as a trick, and that sort of like crystallized him for me as someone who grew up playing a role and understanding what he couldn't do, and sort of grew up essentially in this gilded cage that they're all trapped in now.
Right. I mean, there's so much that is about sort of masks and the ways in which people have to hide their true selves, which feels really like a wonderful conceit for a mystery, as well as like a social commentary about that time period. So
yeah,
it dovetails so beautifully.
It does. And like it is, you know, like I said earlier, like being queer in the 50s was a noir way to be. Like there's just no getting around it.
Right.
You were constant, like to me, noir is about feeling trapped and feeling like you're not going to win no matter what. And that's what I think it must have been like in the 50s. But like I said, I take so much inspiration from the movies, and the movies were made under the Hays Code. So a lot of them end up more optimistic than the books, with these sort of moments of hope, usually by people sort of finding each other. And so they're facing the darkness, but they're not facing it alone. And so that was sort of the thing that I think really spoke to the way I wrote this book.
Wow. So how are you liking this? I mean, the big comparison now is Knives Out. It's a queer Knives Out. Are you?
Yeah, and like everything gets compared to Knives Out now, and like I can't say I dislike it because then someone would yell at me, and also because I'm pretty sure I was the one who came up with that originally when we were pitching it, because I was like, well, we need the modern example of like a Poirot, and there it was.
Right. Right.
Although I will say someone also compared it to Ryan Johnson's other movie, Brick. And like, I like Knives Out, but I love Brick. So that comparison really made me very happy.
Right. That's great.
But, I think it's, if you look at Knives Out as the most recent and prominent example of the country estate genre, then sure, that's what we're saying in terms of comparison. I would argue that Knives Out is a very different kind of movie in that it's more of a fable. To me, Knives Out is a fable dressed as a murder mystery.
I think the other difference is that I think all those people in Knives Out are pretty loathsome, or most of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you've created a rogues gallery of strikingly sympathetic people for the most part.
Thank you. I mean, how can you not? I mean, I didn't want a bunch of evil queers in a house. I feel like that could be a lot of fun too, honestly, now that I've said it out loud. But maybe down the line. But I how can you not find sympathy for queer people living in the 50s? And also you want, I think it's just so much more interesting when the detective likes the suspects. Like, if the detective is like, you're all a bunch of scumbags, I don't care which one of you did it. Like, that's kind of that's a later noir, almost like Mickey Spillane kind of, there's something I don't love about that, because you want, at least I shouldn't say you, I can't speak for everyone, but what I really love in a noir detective is someone who doesn't want to like these people, but can't help it, and is drawn to them, each for their own reason, and sees their humanity. And in seeing their humanity, can also see why they would have murdered someone. I think that is really the interesting sort of aspect of psychological noir. So this isn't it's not a clue-based, twisty thriller noir. Like, that's not what I was setting out to write. But what it is a mystery where the detective has to study these people and understand where they come from and why they would do the things they do, whether those things are good or bad. And like, at the end, not to get too spoilery, but there's another murder, and he is like, okay, that's cool. Because he gets it, he understands it.
And I read something recently, I can't remember, but it was about being a detective. Maybe was it about your book? But one of the reasons that he's a good detective is because he's learned to observe his surroundings, because he's queer and because he needs to know how he fits in.
Yeah, that's sort of the way he thinks about himself. And it's what I think I talked about it in some interview, where my agent early on was like, a detective has to have sort of not a superpower, but like, they have to have a sort of a perspective on investigation. They have to have a unique perspective.
Right.
And so that's where, and I had a lot of trouble with Andy at first. Originally Andy was a much more distant sort of cipher character. And it was in trying to find that and trying to figure him out, and also then working with my editor, who really encouraged me to get a lot closer to him, that I sort of realized the thing about him that's special is that he has spent so long hiding this secret, and so long looking at other people, wondering if they figured out his secret, that sort of paranoia, that he's gotten good at seeing other people do the same thing.
Yeah. I think that's a really great description of what his deductive superpower is.
Yeah, it's essentially queer paranoia.
Yeah. But it works.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense for the time period. And like, once I got a handle on that, and like, I wrote more in the opening about like sort of his arrogance in that respect, and how he's essentially, you get away with it for years. You're a policeman and you're gay policeman, and no one knows for years. That's got to feel like a drug almost, getting away with it over and over again. And I get more into that in the sequel too, which is exciting.
Right. And so, can you talk a little bit about the sequel? You've already signed up to do more
sequel
than
is out
one
next
Andy
fall.
novel?
Yeah, it is called The Bell in the Fog. It's out next fall, and the end of Lavender House sets it up in such a way that Andy can now run a detective agency, which he is doing, and it is not going great a few months in because queer people don't trust a former cop, and non-queer people don't trust a queer detective or even know about him. So he's not having a lot of luck, but then into his office walks a mysterious figure from his past, another noir staple. And I get to go from there, but it gets a lot more into his time in the Navy and the way queer people were treated in the Navy during World War II, and in the government during the Lavender Scare, which is when this takes place.
All right, that sounds amazing.
I'm excited. I mean, we'll see. I'm at the point in edits where I'm like, this could be terrible. Here, editor.
But you have 3 books coming out next year.
I do. I have 3 books. I have Bell in the Fog. Before that, in the spring, I have The Lion's Legacy, which is a young adult book in which a teen whose father is a famous archaeologist of the kind with a hat and a whip, and had a reality show that he was on. But they split up when he was 15 after he figured out his father was not returning the artifacts they recovered to their native cultures, but instead selling them to the highest bidder. So they had a big argument, which resulted in his father abandoning him in Japan at age like 15. They don't speak for 2 years. And then his dad comes back into his life and says, I want you back on the show. And I have a lead on the wedding bands of the Sacred Band of Thieves, which is an ancient Greek army. And Tennessee, the teenager, he really has always wanted to find these bands. He came out on the show. He is famously queer, and he wants to uncover this queer history. And so he goes along with his dad with the promise that he'll get to determine what happens to these rings if they find them. And so it's about, obviously there's ruins and temples to explore and love interests to find, but it's also about who does queer history belong to and why is it constantly erased. Right. And then next holiday, I have Emmett, which is a contemporary queer retelling of Jane Austen's Emma, and much more succinctly described.
Oh my gosh, that sounds great.
Wow.
Yeah, busy. I'm going to go insane next year.
You are very prolific. You are very busy and prolific.
It's just that over the COVID, everything sort of piled up and then it all got sent out around the same time. That's all that happens.
Wow. Okay, well, we have a few questions, so let me just ask you some of these. Sure. Can you talk a little more about your noir influences and why you love the genre so much?
Oh man, I mean, so yeah, the movies definitely, and I can, Big Sleep, Laura, I love Laura, but I've also read everything by Chandler at least twice. I've read, In a Lonely Place, amazing novel. There are a lot of beautiful books from that time period, and like far too many to name them all. But I think what I really love about the genre is the way it has this, it's about people trapped in an ugly world. It's a very cynical genre. It's about how the world, the darkness will win and there's no point in fighting it. And it's about these people who know all that and understand it and will still fight it anyway and are going to do the right thing. Lavender House opens with Andy fired from the force, contemplating suicide, drinking his troubles away. And in the back of the bar, there's a teenager kind of beating on his girlfriends. And he's like, I don't need to fix this. There's no reason for me to go throw him out of the bar. And then he gets up and throws him out of the bar because he just can't help himself. There's a certain nobility. And if you look at old noir writing, there's all these metaphors about like knights and dragons. And that to me is sort of what it's about. It's about taking a chivalric hero and putting them in a modern world that's full of cynicism and telling them that and seeing what happens. And I think that's the real appeal.
Thank you. Okay. Are you worried about all of the book banning that's going on in the US these days?
I mean, generally, yes. But the thing I really worry about when it comes to the book banning is I worry about the actual teenagers who are watching these book bannings. You know, I think about like Texas, my book has been banned all over the place. And I think about these teenagers watching, like I've seen videos of like a priest getting up and being like, this book was, pedophilic essentially. And it's just about, queer teens having sex. So if you're a queer teen and you're watching someone get up and say something like that in your community and no one is speaking out against him, as happens in some of these communities, although less, thankfully, nowadays, people are understanding and fighting back. But imagine what that must be like, especially if you're closeted. Imagine what it must be like to know that your town hates you and hates who you are and wants to make you feel ashamed of what you want. That's what I really worry about, are these teenagers. Like me, yes, it'll hurt my book sales. I don't really care. Like, whatever. These books have been out for years at this point. But the teenagers watching these fights, that's who I worry about.
Wow. That's a very profound answer. Thank you. Are there any plans to turn the book into a film?
I am not allowed to talk about that. My film agent would hurt me.
Okay, just that's what we have. If there's anyone else that wants to ask, now is a good time to just like pop it into the ask a question. I have a question. I
Yes.
want to know what is in your pocket there.
Oh, this is a pocket square with the book cover pattern on it. Because I'm on theme. And there's a piece of cardboard in it so it stays up.
Beautiful. That's beautiful.
So I can't tell because the color's a little off, but is the whole outfit lavender?
This is more of an indigo, but the shirt is lavender, yeah. I have a variety of lavender shirts I've been wearing to these events.
Beautiful. And there's some lavender there behind you on the shelf too. Nice
Yeah,
touch.
there's some fake lavender behind me. I am nothing if not on theme.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both very much for joining us. I want to thank everyone watching tonight. Thank you for supporting independent bookstores. Congratulations on Lavender House.
So much.
Thank
you for having us. And thank you, Dan. I'm so excited I got to talk to Dan about my book finally in a semi-professional setting.
Incredible. And I want to take a picture of like how you both look together, because this is like Dan's so dramatic. He's got this like profile, he's coming out of the darkness, and then you have all the lavender and the lavender house behind you. I mean, it's really just quite beautiful. So
it's really just to mask the fact that I haven't cleaned my study in a while.
Okay, well,
you just live in the darkness, Dan.
Well, yeah, that too.
Anyway, remember you can get copies at any of our stores in Miami, so please come in and pick one up there. You can order it online on our website. And again, congratulations. Best of luck on this journey, and keep going, keep writing, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.